We're gonna make this as easy and straightforward as we can, because if you need to know one thing about this channel is that we do not like jargon over here. Step one is understanding what frame rate is and what frame rate to shoot in order to film the best looking video. Now, a video essentially is just a series of photos or frames that is played very quickly in order to create motion. And the frame rate tells us how many frames are captured per 1 second of video. Now, the industry standard is 24 frames per second, or if we're going to be really technical and really accurate, it is actually 23.976 frames per second, or FPS. And this is also referred to as the most cinematic frame rate to shoot in, which is why it is usually recommended to shoot in 24 frames per second. But there is actually an exception to this rule if you are in Europe or in Australia, for example, because here the industry standard is actually 25 frames per second. Now, would it be a big deal to still shoot in 24 frames per second? Honestly, not really, but you could potentially be dealing with light flickerings in your video, which is not ideal. I'm not going to get too technical, but the reason why is because our electricity power grid in Europe, for example, runs at 50 Hertz, whereas in the US, it runs at 60 Hertz. All you need to figure out before you start shooting is whether you are in an NTSC region or in a PAL region. And let's be really honest, that one additional frame isn't going to be noticeable, and your video is going to look just as cinematic as if you were shooting in 24 frames per second. In your camera, this will be the first setting that you'll want to check, but you also notice that there are actually other options such as 30 or 60 or 120 FPS if you're in an NTSC region, or in Europe, it's going to be 50 and 100 FPS. Now, this means that we can capture even more frames in just 1 second. Is more always better? But this is where slow motion comes in. Very simply put, the more frames we have in just 1 second, the more we can stretch out that second because of all the extra information that we have captured. Let's say that we shot a few clips at 60 FPS and we're going to put that on our 24 FPS timeline. Now, what you'll notice is that it's going to look a little bit stuttery and unnatural. And this is because there is a big difference between the frame rate that we shoot in and the playback frame rate. Now, if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, which again, I hope you do, you want to make sure that your timeline matches that. So your timeline is also set to 24 frames per second. So in this example of our 60 FPS clip, the reason why it looks unnatural and a little bit stuttery is because our 24 FPS timeline will only show 24 out of 60 frames. It's literally taking out 36 frames and it cannot show that. But since we have 36 additional frames, we can slow this 60 FPS clip down to create a super smooth slow motion clip. Here's a quick overview that you can absolutely screenshot with how much we can slow down each clip if you're editing on a 24 FPS timeline. Now, 60 FPS, we can slow that down to 40% or 2.5 times slow motion, and 120 frames per second, we can slow down to 20% or 5 times slow motion. On a 25 FPS timeline, this is a bit more straightforward because at 50 frames per second, we can just half it, so slow it down to 50% or 2 times slow motion, and 100 frames per second, we can slow that down to 25% or 4 times slow motion. Again, feel free to screenshot this or download this overview in the description. Obviously, it's free. I hate to break it to you, but your video is not automatically going to be looking better now because we're shooting at the cinematic industry standard of 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, because there's actually one setting that goes hand in hand with frame rate, and that is shutter speed. Shutter speed is responsible for how natural motion will look in your video. And in my opinion, shutter speed is way easier to understand for video than for photo. And the reason why it is so much easier to understand is because it's literally just one rule that you need to know and you're done. Lock it in, you're good to go. And this rule is called the 180-degree rule. Now, the 180-degree rule says to double your frame rate in order to get the right shutter speed. So if we shoot in 24 frames per second, this would be 1/48th. Now, in your camera, you will see that the closest shutter speed that comes to this is actually 1/50th. So all you got to do is set it to 1/50th and you're good to go. That's it. That's all. Now, what happens if we don't follow this rule? Well, if we were to set this to a slower shutter speed of 1/10 of a second, for example, we will see that our shot looks, let's be honest, it looks kind of drunk. And at 100th of a second, which is a faster shutter speed, it looks very sharp and not really natural. And this is exactly why we want to stick to the 180-degree rule. Now, you probably also noticed that at a faster shutter speed of 1/100th, the video looks a lot darker. And this is because the higher the shutter speed, the less time there is for light to be captured. And that also means that the opposite is true, where a slower shutter speed means that there is more time for light to be captured. So you'll end up with maybe overexposed video. Since we just gotta lock this in and we've now locked in the shutter speed in video mode, depending on the situation, we can now run into the issue of maybe having an overexposed shot or an underexposed shot. And there are 3 easy solutions that you need to memorize in order to master your camera. Solution 1. ISO. ISO is a setting in your camera that produces light artificially, which means that if your video is underexposed, you can just crank up the ISO, increase it, and you will brighten up your video. However, you'll see that the more you increase the ISO, the more noise you'll produce. So if you want to make your video look cinematic or just look good, the rule is to actually just keep your ISO as low as possible and only increase this as your ultimate last resort. So what else can you do? Solution 2 is the aperture. Now, shutter speed and ISO are actually part of what's called the exposure triangle. And the last one to complete this triangle is aperture. The aperture is the number on your camera screen right here, and because it is part of the exposure triangle, this setting also dictates how much light is being captured by your camera. Now, the aperture is actually not a camera feature, but it is a lens feature. This means that how wide your aperture can go all depends on the lens that you're using. If you're dealing with an overexposed video, closing your aperture is a good way to combat this, because when you close the aperture, less light can come into the lens, which darkens your video. However, we all do love that creamy, blurry background, and the only way to get this is by using a wider aperture. But a wider aperture means more light. And this isn't ideal if you want that blurry background, because now your video is overexposed or still overexposed. So tell me, how do the pros do this? Well, they actually use something like this. This is called an ND filter. If all of your settings are locked in, whether that is for technical reasons like your shutter speed, or if it is for creative reasons because you want that creamy, blurry background and your video is overexposed, an ND filter is going to be your best friend. Honestly, this is a must-have if you shoot video, especially if you shoot video outside or in bright surroundings. As you can see, it kind of just works like a pair of sunglasses, but for your camera. I personally use an ND filter for every single clip that I shoot in daytime because honestly, there's just no way around it. Now, I use something called a variable ND filter, or a VND, which just means that one ND filter has multiple intensities, so it can get darker or lighter, versus just having an ND filter that has one intensity. Now, my recommendations would either be this one, which is the Peter McKinnon Polar Pro Helix something. I'll put it in the description. And the other one that I use all the time is the one from K&F Concept. Now, this is a small one for my small lens, but I also have a bigger one for my bigger lens. Pro tip, if you want to get an ND filter, like right now, get the biggest one that you can get, that you can afford, and just get a bunch of step-up rings, put it in the description, because that's going to serve you in the long run. You do not want to end up with a small one and then you get a bigger lens and it doesn't fit. Just get the biggest one and put that on your smaller lens. Now, one more setting that is often overlooked, but can really mess with your colors in your video, and don't ask me how I know, but that setting is white balance. And white balance just makes sure that what is supposed to be white in your video is actually white. And to set this correctly, you can either just hold a white piece of paper in front of your camera, but I'm gonna be honest, that's gonna be a lot to do for every single scene or every single shot. What I would recommend, which is something that I personally do all the time, is to use the default presets that come with your camera, such as daylight and cloudy. I believe most cameras have this nowadays. And this will avoid your camera having a mind of its own and randomly changing the colors, which is the most annoying thing to have to correct. Again, don't ask me how I know. I will admit, this is a lot of information, and I totally understand if you won't remember all of this and you might have to revisit this video a few times, which of course you're more than welcome to. But to make your life and your creative life a little bit easier, I want to share 2 things with you. One is that I have created a little cheat sheet that you can download and you can print and put on your camera. And 2, you can actually save all of these settings in a custom mode on your camera. Most cameras... Okay. Most cameras offer 1 to 3 custom modes, which honestly is perfect because you can now set one mode to 24 frames per second and one to 60. And if you have an additional one, you can even configure one for 120 frames per second. And in order to do this, and you might have to Google this if you don't use Sony, but on a Sony camera is to set all of your settings and then navigate to the menu. And then on the first page, go to number 4, shooting mode, and then camera set memory. I really cannot stress enough how much I would encourage you to do this if you have this option, because this is going to leave little room for errors, as you will not be accidentally shooting in 24 frames per second at 1/100th and vice versa. Again, don't ask me how I know. Mastering your camera settings is the first step in shooting cinematic videos, but if you want to make your videos look truly cinematic, you're going to want to learn about camera movements, composition, audio, and color grading, for example. And lucky for you, I've got a whole series coming covering exactly that. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when the next episode comes out. If you can't wait, this video right here will give you a head start in your videography journey. So be sure to check it out. You.